Hello and welcome to Eastern Marshlands. This is Bolshevik Bistro. Second one on, we didn't even have 7 days between those two. Last time we had Batman Massive on. Now we have a very special guest. It's Angie from the YouTube channel Angie Speaks, and tonight we're going to talk about a lot of heavy stuff. We're going to talk about magic. We're going to talk about spirituality and fascists and their spiritual stuff that they do with esoteric fascism and so on, and talk about postmodern condition even, and what can we do in the fight for the proletariat soul, so to say. Angie, hello, how's it going?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks so much for inviting me on, and I'm super excited to discuss this topic with you.
Same. So, could you please tell a bit about your political alignment and your short pitch of your ideology, so to say? So how do you define yourself politically?
Well, I am an anarchist, but if we're gonna get, I guess, into the nitty-gritty of things, I guess I would call myself a libertarian socialist. So I'm primarily aligned with that tradition, both spiritually and politically. I like to think of myself as an anarchist. I started out as a liberal, just like anybody else. Well, some people don't. People who are lucky enough to, I don't know, have radical parents or whatever. But yeah. I just started out as life as a normal liberal person, and then I kind of started to get more knowledge about radical leftism, and I found myself in some Maoist circles. But then I very quickly kind of became an anarchist, mainly because when I started to kind of examine hierarchy and how that played a role in a lot of the issues that we face on this planet, it just sort of made sense. And also spiritually as well, it kind of made sense to me. So I'm an anarchist.
That's very interesting, because your content, it has a lot of, you talk a lot about spirituality, you talk a lot about all those things that you claim left has neglected, like spirituality, magic, all of those things that have been in the society for a very, very long time. So my question to you is, why do you think, though it is valuable for the left now to address those things?
That it's valuable because the stakes are so fucking high in culture. It's quite obvious that things have kind of reached a boiling point, and part of us being able to formulate a coherent vision for the future is to be holistic about it. Literally, one of the main issues on the left is the fact that we have historically kind of neglected the subjective needs of the individual in favor of the material ones, in favor of a rigid material analysis of things. And even though that's important, it's not the whole picture. And I feel like we have one shot left to get it right. And if we do the same thing again, it's not going to end well. We have to really be holistic in our approach. And that includes taking into account the subjective, psychological, spiritual needs of people and of the collective kind of unconscious that encompasses us all. So I guess that's kind of the short answer.
Okay. And that's an interesting way to put it, because the stakes are extremely high, and there is a part, I must be direct about this. I basically define myself as a Marxist, and I do subscribe to the sort of, say, material approach, but I also see that a lot of things that you're talking about, and a lot of things that basically are, so to say, spiritual, right? They also, they're not really non-material. Those, in many ways, those things arise from the existing conditions of that people exist in. It's just that, for example, the thing that Eugene, right? If we talk about him for a second, he wrote, from my very basic understanding of his theories, he wrote about things that not just ideas, right? All his archetypes and collective unconsciousness, all those things are not really like just like things that people believe. Not necessarily. Those are things that exist somehow among like in almost all, in basically all cultures, and manifest themselves in a very, very different ways based on material conditions. And
Well,
like, yeah,
it's like it's kind of like the whole, you know, materialism, idealism, dialectical materialism fight that has been going on the left for donkey's years.
yeah,
So obviously there are people who are solely materialists who see that way. There's people who are idealists who think that, you know, believe in sort of this almost Neoplatonic idea of how things are. And then there's the dialectical kind of materialist view, which is kind of where I stand on that question. I kind of see these things as having a symbiotic relationship with each other rather than one being dominant over the other. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
What could you please elaborate on that a bit? Like, what exactly what you mean when you say that they exist in this sort of dialectical relationship? Because that's very.
So we're talking about the material and the immaterial, and the relationship between the material and immaterial. So a materialist would say that like all the immaterial stuff is subject to the material conditions. An idealist would say that the immaterial conditions precede the material conditions. I think that the material conditions and the immaterial conditions have a symbiotic relationship with each other. So if there's something that's going wrong with material conditions, that will have a negative effect on the immaterial aspects of human society. The same way that if something goes wrong in the collective unconscious, it can also have a detrimental effect. And it's difficult to pinpoint where things arise from in terms of whether we can blame it on the material conditions or whether we can blame it on something that's gone wrong in the collective unconscious or whatever. It is very difficult to pinpoint the issues in certain cases. And I feel that with a lot of the material analysis, there's kind of a ham-fisted sort of impulse to kind of completely blame it all on the material conditions. Whereas things tend to be a little bit more complicated than that because of this symbiotic relationship that I'm describing, in my opinion, anyway.
When that
makes any sense.
It makes sense to me, at least, because what you're saying reminded me of a phrase, "as above, so below." And
precisely.
Yeah, could you please, because I've basically looked into Alan Moore and all of his shenanigans, and I'm like, Alan Moore is just crazy cool, and he's doing basically like esoteric anarchism, so to say, and his works incorporated this idea. Could you please explain to people who are uninitiated in this idea, what does that precisely mean?
So first of all, I love Alan Moore. Alan Moore has been a massive influence on me. Big time, very big time. If you can see behind me my massive comic book collection. He's the daddy. But as above, so below, he is. As above, so below is edicts from the Hermetic tradition. For those of you who don't know what the Hermetic tradition is, it's an esoteric school of philosophy and magic, a Western esoteric school of philosophy and magic. And the concept of as above, so below basically boils down to whatever happens in the macrocosm also happens in the microcosm. So an example of this could be like the Fibonacci sequence, for instance. We see the Fibonacci sequence in like the smallest snail shell, but it's also the structure that maintains galaxies. So it's the idea, and this concept can be, put in the paradigm of, it could be put in the paradigm of things like that, but it could also be put in the paradigm of our social issues, for instance. So like if there's something going wrong in the interpersonal relationships, there's probably something going wrong in the society. It's like kind of looking at the microcosm and then comparing it to the macrocosm and like looking at the correlations. And it's not always a useful tool, but it has been for me. It's not necessarily applicable to all situations, but it is an interesting way of kind of looking at things to see these correlations and how they kind of evolve, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I believe I have seen a video by the guys at what's the name? Damn, Wisecrack YouTube channel, and they did a video about Alan Moore, and they basically explained what does he mean when he says that he is a magician, and what's basically they try to give some basic understanding of what ritual magic is. Magic, sorry about that. Ritual magic is in his understanding and using examples from his work, and that's pretty interesting because he believes that if we like to boil it down to simplistic, like layman's terms, if we on a microcosm level, like deep inside, realize some big, like if we have a big revelation about the world around us, and he basically means mostly capitalism in this regard. And if we realize where we exist in, it will open our eyes on the macrocosm, and we will be able to, we will change that. It's like in one of his characters, I don't recall the name of the comic, but basically this person obtained like supernatural godlike powers, and the first thing they did to
Dr. Manhattan, probably.
Come again?
Dr. Manhattan, probably, from
no,
Watchmen.
it's actually not Watchmen. It was something else. The first thing that character did is destroyed all money completely. First thing, destruction of money, because it's not based on anything, and it is a thing that keeps the society. It's a macro thing that keeps the micro belief in capitalism alive. And by destroying money, all of the money just disappears. It opens the eyes of the people that it's all a giant bollocks thing. And I believe this idea is an idea that basically any leftist could get behind. So that it's
and I mean it not only in terms of like huge kind of macro thing, but that even on the smaller level of individual to society. That's a macrocosm and a microcosm dichotomy. There's all kinds of microcosm, macrocosm dichotomies that we could be exploring and kind of using these ideas. I mean, in and of itself, in ritual magic, when a magician or a witch or whatever kind of paradigm you want to call yourself, when you construct your circle, when you're in the space of ritual, the circle is supposed to be a microcosm of the universe, as the self is kind of a macrocosm of the universe. And the actions that you play out in that ritual space, are you playing with the microcosm in order to affect the macrocosm? So say you're trying to, I don't know, do a ritual for some kind of end of some sort. You are manipulating the energies of this space that you've created in order to affect something that is within the microcosm. But culturally and politically, that's an amazing tool to employ. And I think that a lot of more people should be sort of thinking this way and kind of moving into that archetype of the magician. Like you said, money is a macrocosm of capitalism. And if you're able to kind of displace that, then the entire egregore falls. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's basically, if we combine, like, get Zizek into this discussion to keep talking about money, that's why if we look at, for example, his critique of ideology, and we sort of look at his conclusions and take as an example, like, food not bombs. This is a group of people that applies direct action. They literally give food for free, and this provokes a radical reactionary response from the state. Like, we have a very small group of vegan anarchists here. Vegan anarchists! Shout out to vegan anarchists. I don't actually know if they're making any videos still, but I love this intro so much I'm still referencing it. So, they are working very hard, and shout out to them. They're a really great group, and I want to get involved with them a bit more, donate some food and maybe volunteer, because they are literally giving out food twice a week in Minsk, right? And the police is just uh, literally asking them to stop, right? And obviously, it's obvious for us, why they're doing it. When when the police officers ask, "What's so bad about what we are doing?" A normal person, human being, right, is just unable to answer. They're saying something like, "It's bad to gather a lot of poor people in one place," and they don't themselves believe in that, because it literally doesn't make sense for people not to be fed, right? And we all understand that. And this sort of action completely destroys this ideology, basically. It's violently ripping people out of it and giving them a look from the outside on this extremely weird relationship that we have with money, food, and people buying food to survive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I definitely agree that is a microcosm that definitely needs to be shifted by leftists. I mean, the whole issue of UBI comes up, for instance. There are some people on the left who are in support of UBI. There are some people on the left who are anti-UBI. The people who are in support of UBI believe that it will shift the microcosm, kind of shift the paradigm to a place where people understand that they don't need to have this thing called money to deserve, a place to live, a place to eat. So they think that UBI may shift people's consciousness to walk more in an altruistic direction, more towards the idea of socialism. I personally think that it would create a new form of feudalism. So I'm not super hot on the idea, but there are people kind of exploring, I guess, whether it be in a positive way or a negative way, the idea that challenging these really basic things, these really basic attitudes, these really basic mentalities that kind of uphold the system as it is. It may seem obvious to you as a leftist because you've done the reading and been through the motions, but to the average person, this is the way things are, and they never actually question it. And you just talking about it isn't going to get them to question it. You have to show them in some kind of big way that things could be different. And I definitely think that employing the mindset of the magician, the archetype of the trickster, these are all different things that can aid us in that process.
When did it go wrong? Tell me. When did we go wrong? When did left abandon the magic stuff? Because from what I know about the anti-capitalist movements, the very early ones that were just on the just starting the whole thing, right? They there were a lot of witches, and there was a lot of this magic component to it. When did it go wrong?
Well, it went wrong with it went wrong in the 20th century. I mean, if you look at the like you said, early leftist movements did have a spiritual component, but that spiritual component was still on the margins, and it was always at odds with the sort of hardline materialist attitude. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at, it's not even just with spirituality. I mean, with art, for instance. One really awesome example of this that I actually did in a video that I made about Dadaism is the art movement in and of itself. A lot of the Dadaist artists were spiritual people, and they saw their art and what they were putting out into the world as spiritual. They made no bones about it. People like Andre Breton, people like Francis Picabia, all of the different famous Dadaists that were in Zurich, during the early 1920s. They were all spiritual people involved in some occult activity or the other, and they were also communists. And part of what alienated them from the Communist Party is that the Communist Party, the hardline Communist Party that was in Berlin at the time, they really, really, really thought that it was frivolity. They thought that, they're fighting a battle against capitalism. And whether we want to admit it or not, capitalism is a fucking brutal force. And fighting capitalism is no easy feat. And they were experiencing subversion, they were experiencing all kinds of things that, you know, were causing fear and terror. And the fact of the matter is they saw things like spirituality as superfluous. They saw things like art as superfluous. They saw the people who were involved in the creation of meaning and the creation of culture as completely superfluous. So therefore, they believe that in order to be effective within a communist party, everything you do needs to contribute towards the furtherment of the revolution. And this is an area that the, I guess, Dadaists completely disagreed with, because they believe that the job of the artist was to interpret the human condition. And
Right.
any fault or mistake in the interpretation of the human condition is a mistake in the interpretation of the universe, and therefore a hindrance to its transformation. So actually there you can see the whole as above, so below principle. They believe that interpreting the human condition, which is the job of the artist, was in fact interpreting the universe. And to correctly interpret those things allows for its positive transformation. So they weren't interested in short-term goals of propagandizing for this thing or trying to further this thing or, you know, trying to get the proletariat to do this or that. They were playing the long game. They're looking at it from the magician's perspective. And this really put them at odds with the Communist Party. So that's, like, I guess, one historical example of where things went wrong. You look at China, for instance, when, you know, with like the communist revolution that happened in China, one of the first things they did was try to purge the country of religion. And not all religion, the religions that weren't compatible with what they were trying to create. For instance, Confucianism is still kind of widely practiced and celebrated in China, but that's because Confucianism has always been in alignment with the state. Its philosophy facilitates a sort of hierarchical system. But Taoism, for instance, different strains of Buddhism, different strains of Jainism, all of these different things. Taoism, more in particular, is incredibly anti-hierarchical. I see the Tao Te Ching as like the first anarchist manifesto. If you've ever read it before, you'll understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
I've
listened to a lecture of a Russian anarchist professor, and he referred to Taoism as not, like he says, they're not like anarchist in our understanding, but that's the first, like, what we could define as anti-authoritarian, anti-state movement. Yeah, and I believe that 100%. Taoism is a thing that, like, any leftist should look into, because it is, it's extremely interesting. Yeah.
Yes, it is. I have actually gotten, I actually just got one of my other creator friends, Peter Coffin, to read the Tao Te Ching, because he's reading it now and he's like being blown away. But yeah, it is incredibly anti-hierarchical, incredibly anti-authoritarian. And these were the religions that the Chinese state at the time, it wasn't really communism. It was state-run capitalism, if you will. But like, they repressed. They repressed these forms of religion heavily, and, you know, tried to instill the state as the new thing to give people meaning. Because what's religion there to do? What is spirituality there to do? It's to aid in the process of birth, life, and death. It's the midwife for birth, life, and death. It's the thing that gives life meaning. It's the thing that, it's a well and sort of a reservoir of all the different things that give life meaning, whether that be beauty or connection or transpersonal experience, or any of those things that nobody can control. That's the thing about these subjective areas of human life. Nobody can control those things. They can't be quantified. They can't be measured. If someone was to ask me, like, how much do you love your boyfriend? There's absolutely no way that I can quantify and measure that. It just is. And there's an element of that cold, hard, scientific, sort of materialist view that is very uncomfortable with things that it cannot quantify and it cannot measure. The subjective frightens it. So it tries to stamp it out as much as possible and instill the state as the means from which we're supposed to derive all of the subjective things, and it's not healthy. It's bad. You know, I could go on about same thing with Russia, with you know, the Soviet Union and
Yeah.
kind of that regime. You know, there was a very kind of rigid mentality towards the idea that these things were counter-revolutionary, and in some cases they were even labeled as inherently fascistic, which is another, I guess, area that we'll probably end up discussing at some point. But yeah, there are plenty of areas where it went wrong, but it was really a war. It was a war between the subjective needs of man and the need for material stability, and these things, and the mentality that sort of pits these two things against each other when they're really actually meant to be married and like dancing with each other all the time. So yeah, that's kind of
I actually wanted, I got it, and I wanted to add to your thing about China and expand some of the stuff about religion and Soviet Union. So, based on my knowledge, the war against religion is a very, very interesting thing, because it mostly manifested itself in the 30s and like 20s and 30s. And despite the fact that official atheist policy and like atheist theater was a thing, and they did plays in the atheist plays and stuff like that, they did a lot of propaganda and said that the culture, right, the new culture should remove, like destroy the religion. Like, if we have a new culture that is based on the ideology, that is based on proletarian identity, then the religion will be destroyed. And there is a thing, you know, the imagery and the symbolism of Orthodox Church in Russia was heavily used by the white god. It was extremely fascistic at the time, and we see that we see that the church very often supported like in Spain with Pope to like meeting with Hitler and all of that stuff. You know, the church and fascism are all very close when it comes to destroying the left. But a very interesting thing is all of that completely changed with the Second World War, because when the Nazis came, all of a sudden we see Russian Orthodox Church donating tanks to the front. We see churches being opened and all of a sudden supported by Soviet Union. We see a lot of nationalism being reborn in Soviet Union, because why is it so, like, why is Stalin's Soviet aesthetic so, how do I say that? So there is still an interest for that aesthetic, right? It's still very powerful. It's mostly because it was a merger of those, you know, heroes of the old, very archetypical, like a lot of archetypes give into that. Like we have all those ancient Russian warrior types, you know, patriarchs, kings, and like tsars, the glory of the Russian people, nationalism, the church, all of those things had a place in that time, in the Stalin's aesthetic, in the Stalin's Soviet Union. And they never left after the war. They still lingered on. And that's why, actually, when the time came for the Soviet Union to fall apart, it was heavily utilized. Those ingrained ideas were heavily utilized by the bourgeoisie and are still utilized by the bourgeoisie. And because they just don't go away. Like the same heroes and the church as even less than an institution, but more as a belief system, you know, even. So there is a lot to that, and that was actually very helpful, because that was extremely motivating for the people who were doing crazy things to win the war, both on the front and beyond the front, in the factories, at home. The fight was everywhere, and people were mobilized partially because of that. So
definitely.
Yeah, my question to you is, um, what sort of relationship does fascism have to mysticism and spirituality? Because it is not, it's different, right? It's not, for example, what Dadaists were doing. It's not what you were talking about. It is
Yeah,
different, isn't it? Could
yeah.
you please elaborate on what's the difference between what they're doing and what do you think we should be doing as the left?
Well, it's a big difference, but also like the relationship that fascists have to spirituality and I guess esotericism, I guess I should say, is a lot bigger than the left, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
because the left has historically abandoned this territory, which is stupid because this is where meaning is created. And meaning is what creates culture. And if we abandon the tools that are used to create culture and we leave that to the forces of reaction, then we're doing ourselves a massive disservice. But I'll digress back to the original question, which is, you know, what is the difference between the relationship? The difference between the relationship is that the transformative power of these sort of esoteric ideas are only used in an aesthetic way with fascists. That's the thing. They
Mm-hmm.
use it as an aesthetic. They use the powerful aesthetics in order to make an impact on the zeitgeist. And then they may use some of the ideas to, I guess, subvert their enemies and do different things like that. But with the left, with the potential for it on the left, because it hasn't actually been seen at play on the left yet, but the potential for it on the left, what it could look like is not only the aesthetics and, you know, the symbolism being employed as a means to kind of gain footing in those zeitgeist, but real transformational energy, something that really does overhaul society, and also something that actually has a positive effect on the individual rather than putting the individual into sort of rigid categories, per se. They're not, the fascist spirituality isn't necessarily concerned with the individual. It's concerned about creating what in the occult we like to call an egregore, sort of a collective thought form that they can then use as a stamp of identity, rather than actually using it to empower individuals to then empower a community, if you know what I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. But could you please elaborate a bit on uh, the transformative powers? Like, how do you think it could look like for the modern left? How would it look different from the Nazis? Because I agree with you, it is just a coating on their side. It's literally just the
Yeah,
like a picture. But what does it truly
yeah.
mean to embrace spirituality for in terms of politics and transformative change?
Well, for, I guess, them, it's a picture, but it works. It's a picture that works. It's a powerful picture. But in terms of what embracing spirituality as a transformative force on the left could look like, this is a question that I'm constantly asking myself. But to sort of answer your question, I guess, in my own words, it comes down to really defining what spirituality is and why
Mm-hmm.
it's different from religion. Like, spirituality, to me, embracing spirituality has absolutely nothing to do with everybody picking a spiritual paradigm and running with it, or to taking on some form of Eastern religion or this. No, it has to do with paying attention and also, I guess, understanding the importance of the subjective areas of human life and creating a society where those things are not suppressed but encouraged. Fascist spirituality wants to suppress those subjective areas. Capitalism actively hinders us from being able to explore and individuate within those areas. What leftist quote unquote spirituality would look like is us working towards slash building a society where those subjective needs are not only taken into account but are also facilitated. So, for instance, I guess somewhere where the cultivation of beauty is allowed to everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic background, an environment where things like mental health and the ability to kind of individuate and be the best version of yourself is something that society actively encourages and doesn't bar other people from based on how much money they have. An environment where people aren't, you know, working 9 to 5 and in selling their labor to capitalists. An environment where people can actually like live out their fullest potential and pursue their interests to the fullest of their ability. This to me is leftist spirituality, like taking into account what people need, and then creating an environment where those things are facilitated. I think that that's like the biggest kind of spiritual goal of the left, because it's one thing to provide people with shelter, food, healthcare, and all the things that we need to survive materially. It's another thing to create an environment where people are truly allowed to thrive and enjoy and experience the fullness of all of the things there are to enjoy on this planet, whether that be nature, whether that be love, whether that be creative expression, whether that be any of the things that, you know, cannot be measured or quantified. If we ignore those things in favor of creating a society where everybody has a room to sleep in, everybody has a chicken in their pot, you know, all the basic material things are taken care of, we're only going to create new forms of alienation. And that's the reason why fascist regimes are incredibly alienating to the people who are involved in them, because those subjective needs aren't taken into account. Capitalism doesn't give a fuck about your subjective needs. So we cannot repeat the same mistake. Like if we look at some of those regimes that I was talking about, you know, these quote unquote communist regimes,
right?
Yeah, like things like brutalist architecture. Yes, it was supposed to be sort of a proletarian architecture. Yes, it was supposed to be something that sort of represented a type of beauty that wasn't in need of frills and frivolity. But the majority of people find it incredibly alienating. You know, even though it does all the things it's meant to do, it houses you, it keeps you dry, it shelters you from the elements. That beauty, that frivolity, that coziness, that comfort, we need that shit as human beings. And also we need nature as well. And, you know, I think that brutalist architecture is kind of a key example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. It does the functional job of providing people with a place to live, but it doesn't do any of the subjective jobs. So I guess that's my idea of leftist spirituality. It has very little to do with, I guess, religion or anything in that regard, because not everybody is going to embrace that side of themselves. And to try and force it on people would be like weird and authoritarian. What my business is to, since I'm a spiritual person, is to honor the things that are useful within these spiritual paradigms and bring them to a place where they can be useful for everybody, regardless of belief or lack thereof.
Yeah. The chat is mentioning brutalist architecture, and you talked about it. To be frankly, completely honest with you, I live in a house that was built in the 70s. I live in such a place that is like a panel apartment building. And I could tell you that my neighborhood, especially in winter, oh my god, it looks like
depressing.
A PUBG level that's like with depression sprinkled on top of it. It's utterly depressing.
Yeah.
It's
because
just
it's not natural to natural to how we're supposed to live as humans. We're not supposed to live in concrete cinder blocks. We're supposed to live like nature. We're supposed to live where there's trees. We're supposed to live where we can, like, if you talk to people who are involved in city planning and architects, and you know, they tend to follow the zeitgeist. They tend to follow the economic models and the needs of the zeitgeist and the economic model. And I live in a city, you know, where there isn't much nature. I live in a city where if I want to experience nature, I have to like go to a park or find some kind of reserve or, you know, something like that. And these things are alienating. To be in a place that is completely removed and alienated from nature, it may be economically, it may be economically cheaper to build things like that. but it really fucks with people mentally. Like, it really does fuck with people mentally to have these sort of alienated structures represent, you know, homesteads. You know, I think that it could be a master of taste for some people, but I think in terms of taking into account what people need to make them happy and feel at ease, I think nature is a big part of that for a lot of people. Being able to like see and experience the natural world without feeling like you're alienated from it.
Yeah, and I must also point out that basically the historical part of Minsk, most of it, right? We have all the new neighborhoods are built on the outskirts, but we have most of the city was destroyed during the Second World War. It was just leveled, right? And it was rebuilt from scratch, from zero, from ground level in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, during Stalin's era. And for people interested in this sort of stuff, Google Stalinist architecture, and they have like one must distinguish between brutalism, those, you know, empty apartment buildings, you know, like that all look the same, and they're literally like, if you could look at pictures from St. Petersburg, Moscow, Riga, and Minsk, and not distinguish which city is where, because it's literally the same project, the same building. And it was like Stalinist architecture is different. It's attempting to make a claim on the human nature. It's modernist in its nature. In its nature, it's fake columns, socialist symbolism everywhere. It's very green. Like most of the city center is just a giant like park, named after Gorky, the writer, and like it's attempting to make a claim on the human nature. I believe it's attempting to make a claim on what proletarian culture is, and I believe that it fails. It ultimately fails at it, and it's still fascinating. It's still utterly beautiful, and I follow some Instagram accounts that like post pictures and want to preserve socialist modernism as an architectural style. They want to preserve the buildings built in it, and I believe on their own they have value. They really have value, because you can see the ambition of the socialist movement. You can see the honesty in their claim.
In the museum. It belongs in the museum, in my opinion, because okay, we could say all we want about Bruce's architecture, but like, it's no accident that like the Thatcherite government in the 1970s, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialist aspirations, appropriated this and used it to create state housing in the UK. Yeah. Specifically because it's the type of architecture that alienates. You know, I mean, here, one of my favorite places to go in London is the Barbican. And the Barbican kind of takes on that brutalist style. It almost feels like I'm in Clockwork Orange. It has this kind of very like 70s sci-fi kind of, vibe to it. And I think it's architecturally interesting. Would I want to live there? Probably not. And do I think it's an accident that the Tory government, the far right government of this country, appropriated this form of architecture in order to create state housing? Absolutely not. They know exactly what the fuck they were doing when they did that. For me, okay, whatever. It represents socialist aspirations, great. Like, it belongs in the museum, but I'm talking about the future. I'm talking about our visions of the future. Our vision of the future cannot be modeled on those old models. Like you said, these things were trying to sort of stake a claim in specifically what the future should look like, what proletarian aspirations should look like. And I think that that's the material entering the dangerous territory of the subjective, a territory where it doesn't fucking belong. Like, leave that, like, if only they would just if only those regimes would just step the fuck off and leave, you know, the artists and the creative people and the spiritual people and the crazy people to do their thing without trying to interfere and claim stake somewhere it doesn't belong, I think that maybe things would have turned out differently. But I think looking forward, these are the kinds of things that we need to pay attention to.
Here I must also direct everyone interested in this sort of critique. I must mention the situationists. They started with architecture. They started with the critique on the architecture and alienation in architecture. Like, if Stalinist architecture made a claim and the brutalist architecture started to, isolate people, and then the Tories started, like, it started even before that. They said that even in the 60s architecture, the cities, they were designed to keep us away. They were designed to exploit. This, like, when your world around you is designed to exploit you, to keep you down, it's not a surprise. Then again, returning to the as above, so below principles that we talked about, it's not a surprise that a person will feel alienation in everything. Not just with the fact that, oh, I worked for 8 hours, but I got paid basically like 4 hours if we count in like my based on my production and not my like job market, blah blah blah. It's not just that. Everything around you is designed that way. Everything around you tends to be designed this way because it's beneficial to the ruling classes. And I believe that you're completely agree on that, and left should really think about those things. And another point that you were talking about the human soul and how how immaterial, how the left failed the immaterial. I believe that Douglas Lane at Zero Books did a video. I don't remember what they were talking about specifically. It was someone else, but basically they were talking about again situationists in May '68, and they were talking about this sort of idea that the left exists in this very unhealthy, from the spiritual and basically even material standpoint, on this, dichotomy: revolution or suicide. There are two ways. There is nothing else. And we can see, if we look at the failed revolutions, and the most blatant example is again May '68 in Paris, in France in general. The leader, the founder of the situationist movement, Guy Debord, committed suicide in the '70s. And that's the thing. Like, we tend to view worlds from the critical lens, but we forget to make a positive statement. We tried to make it before, right? But like, I believe that socialist modernism is an attempt to make a claim. And unfortunately, what I believe the left is not doing now, it's not making a claim. That's the thing. We must realize where they made a mistake, and we've pointed out how, like, they started to go where they shouldn't have gone, right? They started to rationalize the thing that they can't rationalize. And I believe that here lies an answer to why postmodern condition brings us down, why postmodern condition ultimately prevents the working class from organizing like we used to, because we don't say anything. Like, we don't say anything that we could claim. Like, there is literally just revolution or suicide. There is nothing else. There is no there is no other way to view the politics, view our ideologies, and ultimately this leads to failure. Ultimately to failure, because how can you even get the working class behind you if that's your solution? Ultimate utopia and full communism, or it's pointless. It's very impractical, and we fail the spiritual side of humanity in this regard completely.
Which is why no one wants to sit with us.
Come again?
I said that's why no one wants to sit with us at the lunch table.
Yes, because we just talk about how everything is that, like, we just sit around criticizing stuff, and I think it's great. It's great to deconstruct, and we should keep doing that. But there are other things that we're not doing. I believe a positive claim on the humanity is a thing that humanity needs now more than ever. That the workers need now more than ever. And
exactly, I agree.
Because
100%.
fascists do that. Fascists have a claim, though. They have the heroes. They have the great past, right? They have their legacies, and actually, my country is like, and just Eastern Europe is not without esoteric fascists. We have a so-called pan-Slavic, neo-pagan, neo-fascists, right? And they have their extremely weird ideas about what the Slavic culture is and what it used to be, and they try to steal that. You know, they try to appropriate basically the spiritual side. They use esoteric aesthetics to appropriate that and use it, but they try to make claims that and then utilize that. But what I believe the difference is, while the fascists are using this as a facade to perpetuate their interests, what we need to do is we need to truly understand how we can emancipate the human soul from the oppressive situation we have now, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely an area where our attention needs to be, but we're trying. I mean, the spiritual left, I guess, isn't like really a community per se yet, even though there are people who are loosely, I guess, aligned with each other in that regard. Like, my content is featured on Gods and Radicals. They're a really amazing pagan anti-capitalist publisher, and you make friends through that kind of thing. You meet different people. There's also like a very unsavory element of the spiritual left community as well, believe it or not, that kind of perpetuate a lot of toxic culture that they've learned from liberalism and capitalism, if you understand what I mean. Things like purity, call outs, all of these sorts of elements of things are things that you find, within any sphere of the left. So why wouldn't you find it in the spiritual left community? But it's not, like I said, it's not really a community per se. But there are a lot of people who are putting out ideas and resources. And the more of us do that, the better, I guess, the situation would be. But it's kind of, it's alienating to be a leftist, number one. It's almost like doubly alienating to be a spiritual or esoteric leftist, because you're alienated for being a leftist, but then the left also wants to alienate you for not towing the party line, I guess, of being like completely, I guess, materialistic in your analysis of things. So it can be quite an alienating job, but there are people who are open to it, which is, something that wouldn't have been the case maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. People like me and people from Gods and Radicals and things like that would not be able to speak openly about spirituality without people calling us crypto-fascists or, making assumptions about our logical faculties, all those sorts of things. So I guess in that sense, the portal is opening up. And I think the thing that kind of triggered that was, the zeitgeist shift of 2016, things like Brexit, the election of Trump, all the weird little things that, were on the fringes, all the weird little things that sort of only lived in the land of crazy internet have now kind of crawled out and like broken their way into reality. Like, that barrier is now broken, like, which is what I think a lot of people don't understand. The barrier between reality and unreality is no longer, it's eroding day by day. And that's a great thing if you're a magician. It's not so great if, you're trying to stay sane and like, be a normal person. But it is definitely a great thing if you're a magician for that kind of barrier to be shifting. And I wish that we would kind of get our shit together and make it shift to our advantage, rather than just constantly being swept to and fro by the cultural currents, which seems to be kind of the affect on the left. Nobody really thinks critically about what's going on in the above. They only focus on what's going on in the below. So yeah, I think people need to think about the macrocosm a little more. Definitely.
Yeah, and I believe that it's great to be cautious, right? about who exists in our spaces, who exists in our communities, and it's important to understand who is your friend and who's not. But I believe that mislabeling, like we disagree all the time with each other. Like there is no agreement on the left, and that's a great thing. And we should remember that in any community, especially small, traditionally fringe, communities, it's a very the purity, thing, the purity aspects of like who is the real X. You are not the real X. We see it like in Jewish communities where every single group says that you must be Jewish is this, and if you're not, then you're not Jewish, and if you're this, you should do this. If you're not this, you're not. You like we disavow you, etc. Same with the left. We shouldn't do that. We should be really conscious of that. Like, if we are very diverse and we come to similar, like, great example is some revolutions of the 20th century. People utilized emancipatory politics of the left to achieve their own goals without necessarily embracing this as their main ideology. Like Black Panthers in America are first and foremost a black liberation movement that saw socialism as a weapon that could liberate the people. And the same with many other people, like as you mentioned, the pagan communities. There are people who have their set of beliefs, right? And for them, the logical conclusion of those beliefs is revolution and destruction of capitalism. And those are the people who are not pure in terms of ideology. They are not pure in terms of the theory, right? But those are the people who came with you with a rifle and are ready to fight. And I believe that we should talk to each other and figure out whom to shoot and not point guns at each other.
Exactly. I fucking agree so fucking much. And I wish that purity aspect didn't exist. I wish that people would kind of mature beyond it. But like you said, that was my process. I saw my spiritual beliefs were what led me to the conclusion I have found with anarchism. And like you said, I see anarchism as being the tool that it can be used in order to liberate things like the earth, liberate things like the human spirit, dismantle systems of oppression, that oppress women, people of color, all of those things, and therefore I may not be ideologically pure or like completely sound in terms of theory, but I'm willing to fucking fight alongside you. And the fact that that people like me are being uninvited from the party really pisses me off. There's all kinds of purity games going on, purity games that occur in terms of political correctness, purity games that occur because of a myriad of things, and it all just kind of works to sort of derail any momentum. And it sort of seems like there's an impulse to purge, especially spiritual people from the leftist community. And that purge instinct isn't necessarily always just directed towards spiritual people. It's like there's a weird group or faction of, I like to call purgy, cancelly leftists, who literally want to cancel everybody until there's no one left but them. We need to do something about this affect, because it's going to fuck us up in the long run. I know that, there was some incidents that happened, before the beginning of the new year, where a prominent figure on the, I guess, spiritual left was sort of outed as an abuser, allegedly. And basically, after that, there were a lot of attacks being directed towards the spiritual community as a whole, which I found pretty disturbing, because none of us did anything. This person espoused a lot of useful things that didn't change. That doesn't change the fact that they're allegedly did whatever to someone. The thing that kind of irritated me about the whole situation was that there was kind of a bit of a purge campaign. People who had been waiting for an excuse to attack the spiritual left saw this as their opening, the opening for them to do that, basically. which obviously created a lot of infighting and division. And that's the thing that annoys me, is like, but why is that always our impulse? Why can't we try something different? You know, why can't we actually, like, you know, do the work of building communities rather than like completely tearing each other apart when things don't go according to plan? Or, you know, it just, yeah, these are the things I'm thinking about, because obviously we have to worry about the fascists and this and that, but sometimes I'm more fucking scared by the people in this community.
Oh
Sometimes I am more scared, you know, and like, you know, it's more disheartening as well, because it's coming from within your own home, if you know what I mean. If it was
Yeah.
outside, it would be understandable.
I completely agree with you. And if I had a clear answer why this is happening, like why are we just looking for a reason to destroy each other, I would be so happy to know that, and I would tell everyone to stop doing that. But like, I really don't know why. Like, I don't know if anyone knows ultimately why this is happening. Like, and I don't think it's just the fact that we just hate each other. I think it's deeper than that. But I ultimately can't pinpoint the reason. But I completely agree with you on every single point. And we see that witch hunts are still a thing, and they're still going on, and they're going on, you know, within our communities, and we should be.
Yeah, it's sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is sad. It's very sad, and I believe that, like, when all of a sudden we have another sex scandal on the left, like, because that's on the internet left specifically, like, there is a frequent sex scandals, and I find this like extremely weird. Like, this thing shows up, then another one, and another one. Almost all of them are sex related, and I'm like, people, just like liberate yourself, like get laid finally, and like relax about the whole sex thing, or don't. If you don't want to get laid, don't, and like let's all be happy.
It's power dynamics, which is the thing that kind of it is the thing, basically, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's power dynamics, my advice to people is don't shit where you eat. You know, if you're in a position of power over somebody, whether that be a fan of your work or somebody who admires you or someone who looks up to you, don't fuck them. There are plenty of people for you to fuck in the world. You don't need to use your power and influence in order to like get laid. That's like weird. And even if it's malicious or it's not malicious or whatever, like it still puts you in a position of like jeopardy to just like don't fuck people who are like, I guess, admire you or have some kind of, I guess, position of subservience beneath you or whatever. Like it's just kind of like a don't shit where you eat thing, and like kind of being more responsible in that regard. But back to the whole kind of scandals and the spectacle of scandals and things like that. People love drama, you know, like the stream I did about the incident that occurred was probably the most popular in terms of view stream that I've ever done. You know, when I'm talking about mundane like stuff or things that I'm interested in with this, like, you know, I may get like a couple thousand views. But this specific stream got thousands of views. I think it's like at 5,000 views or something like that.
Yeah.
Because people like drama, people want, and I feel like people need to start questioning and interrogating that impulse towards kind of wallowing in the gutter of certain issues. And in that stream, I specifically made sure that I wasn't talking about the people involved and digging into the nitty-gritty of what may or may not have happened, because that's none of my fucking business at the end of the day. I focused the energy and the attention that I got from that stream in order to direct energy towards what was actually going on in the community in terms of how people were reacting to it by these purges and this ideological purity. And, you know, it's kind of the main issue right now on the spiritual left is us feeling like this incident has kind of given, well, I can only speak for myself and those around me. I can't speak for everybody because there are members of the spiritual left that are fucking crazy people. But there's the people who I'm aligned with and the people who I know were adjacent to whatever, were open to attack. People were calling people crypto fascists. People were saying that it was his spiritual beliefs that made the person act in the way they did. They were just trying to sort of purge us out of the community because they had finally found an excuse, which was quite disheartening. And I really wanted to stop. But the good news is we have people who are not part of the quote unquote community, other leftist creators and people with platforms who have really rallied behind and supported us because they understand what our place means in this community. They know that people like me are here to give the left medicine. They understand that we're here to give the left a soul and a conscience. And they see why this is important. And that's specifically what I've tried to do with my platform, is to be that and to give that, to be that medicine woman, to give people the bitter pill, even if they don't want to swallow it, and to kind of heal some of the areas of tension within our collective unconscious, and also to give the left a heart and a soul and a conscience. That has been the ethos of my work ever since I began. Not to push spirituality on anybody who's not interested in spirituality. I'm not trying to start a cult. So yeah.
Yeah, I believe that you're extremely correct. Drama and beef is a thing that exists in all the communities, every single one of them, be it on the internet or outside of the internet. If you have communities and you have people's identities shaped by those communities, drama will happen. The question is, how do we collectively police it? How do we collectively deal with it? Because
by not rewarding it with social capital,
yeah,
because attention is the currency. Well, I don't want to give too much away, but I have a video coming out about this literally this weekend. But in the sphere we're working in, these spheres are owned by capitalist interests, and the metrics are capitalistic. And in these capitalist social spheres, attention is currency. Okay, and that attention then evolves into social capital, which in some cases can evolve into real capital, meaning money, like Patreon, donations, all those things. But more often than not, it turns into social capital, clout, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And the reason that this shit happens is because it's rewarded with attention, which then gives it social capital. So we reward it. That's the truth. The systems and the metrics that we use based on the platforms that we're on, none of us are self-aware enough to actually interrogate our behavior and how these systems manipulate and change our behavior. So we just kind of go along with the current and don't really fully think about things or examine how this might play out and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's because it's rewarded, which is why it flourishes, because it creates social capital, and that's what everyone's after.
How can we deal with that if these things are literally shaped by, like economics, so to say? By
subverting the metrics and being, number one, being mindful of how the metrics work, subverting those metrics and then using them to our advantage. But it starts with being mindful of those metrics, and so many people don't want to look at those metrics because they benefit from them. That's just the truth. They benefit from those metrics. And if we create a system where that kind of thing isn't rewarded, where social capital isn't the driving factor behind all of this stuff, then a lot of people will suffer because of that, in terms of like being out of a job or this or that or whatever. So yeah, people don't want to look at it because it's better to just kind of go along with the current than it is to subvert or challenge it. But that's the role of the magician, and like the energy that I work with spiritually is one of upheaval. It's one of it's like almost like a Kali energy, like to overturn and destroy systems, to destroy concepts, to destroy things that no longer serve us. And because of that, I know I'm going to probably generate a lot of enemies, but it's the work that needs to be done. So yeah, hopefully I'm strong enough to deal with it. I mean, I may not be, so.
Well, I really hope that you will, because there are people in our communities that really don't want this all boil down to just hate and bickering and excommunications, and it's literally shooting ourselves in the foot. And if we come down to it, like I have seen in some cases, right, where scandals, I won't be specific here because I don't really want to be right specific, but I've seen some scandals on the left that were dealt with very well, like so well that sometimes they don't even appear like on Twitters, right? They are dealt with internally. Or if they go public, the community realizes what is the problem, how do we deal with it, and like what should we do. But it's so rare. Like, I know that we can. I know that we can be civic. I know that we can be like grateful that we have an opportunity to communicate internationally with the workers all around the world, with each other, build something, right? Build something great, build something that will last. But again, we fail, and there are many things that are ongoing now, right? That we just like fall apart. And here, because here I want to be specific. I don't want to go into details. It's not a topic I'm willing to discuss at the moment, but it is a giant discussion over sex work. It's a thing that is happening on the YouTube left, at least. Is all this sort of very hard and heavy stuff about sex work is all around. People are talking, taking a stance, making claims, but not in the way that, like, you're aware of this whole thing, right? That's going down.
I've seen a little bit of it. I mean, I know that there's a bit of a fight going on about whether sex work is considered legitimate or illegitimate, whether leftists should support the concept of sex work or not. I have seen a little bit, if that's what you're referring to.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And we have this. It's a legitimate question, I believe, that must be agreed upon. It's a thing that exists. Therefore, we should talk about it. But I don't think that the current climate that we have now we won't be able to come to any conclusions, because it's literally just hatred of each other mostly. It's.
My thing is, like, why does there need to be a consensus though? Like, why do we need to have a prevailing idea? Like, not everything in life is that simple, which is what kind of annoys me about things. There's nuance. This kind of annoys me about. There's this idea that we have to come to this ultimate conclusion, and like, unfortunately, life doesn't really work that way. It makes me feel like a lot of people don't live in reality. They just kind of live in Twitter land. It makes me feel like people don't have any interpersonal relationships of their own to draw inspiration from, or haven't experienced enough of life to understand that it's a fucking messy pool of all kinds of different energies flying at you at once. And when it comes to this specific issue, like, why does there need to be a consensus? Of course, there are some forms of sex work that are exploitative. There are some forms of sex work that don't even involve sex. There are forms of sex, there's all kinds of different forms of sex work. And I feel like those who want to support sex work should support it. And those who are still on the fence about it should be on the fence about it. You don't have to force everybody into this sort of consensus around it. And because somebody's on the fence about it and they're still trying to think about it and they're still trying to formulate whether or not they agree in their head, doesn't make them this awful fucking person that needs to be cancelled. There doesn't need to be a consensus on this issue. Like, if you want to support sex workers, then fucking go and support sex workers. That's probably a better use of your time than trying to fight people on Twitter about why their take is bad or this or that. Like, people are, it's quite exhausting. And it doesn't provide a good space to have any sort of conversations. But then again, can these platforms really facilitate conversation? Because they are built they're built on metrics that basically facilitate some of the worst aspects of human nature, which is precisely what we're seeing. So we have to be mindful of that, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, the chat. Oh, we have a Nazi in chat. How's it going? I think you googled esoteric fascism and found the tag. How's it going? You're getting muted, my guy. We
Oh,
have
gross.
amazing.
Ew.
I just love this stuff. Oh my god.
Oh dear.
Okay, yeah. For watching this, we have a guy in here talking about Bolsheviks and the Jewish conspiracy. I love this stuff.
Oh dear. Oh
Um,
God.
I think that's a great time to get look back at what we discussed, because
Sure.
I believe that what you're bringing to the table is extremely important. That the same questions, ultimately, even the same questions, are being asked by the left all the time. Is what is humanity? What is ultimately emancipation and liberation? And where does, even starting with Marx, with the human soul, he was talking about those things. He was talking about the liberation of the essence of humanity, right? And those are the things that we shouldn't ignore, or think of some abstract thing that exists somewhere. It's a thing that exists in all of us, and I believe that we should deal with that, and we shouldn't reject everything as crypto-fascism because it sounds weird. When there are liberals who are doing that with communism. There are liberals who are saying that communism is fascism, and we shouldn't do the same in our own communities, because the only people, we should just stop, and we should be very critical and very conscious about those things, and we should empower the voices that are not heard, and we should really come to people and realize that it is us who must come to them and not them who should come to us in the end of the day. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I totally agree. Obviously, we have to be conscious about the ways in which, these sort of esoteric ideas that we've discussed are being employed by fascists. I think that it's a big mistake on the left if we just kind of look at them and call them LARPers and, laugh at their ridiculousness without actually understanding what they're doing. Like you said, it's claiming territory, it's claiming meaning. And we can't afford to surrender those territories in that regard, because we're really doing humanity a disservice if we do. We need to start claiming territory, positive territory of our own, and giving people, a positive vision to look forward to. That doesn't include anybody embracing any form of spirituality they don't feel comfortable with. It's more just taking into account that the subjective, the mythic, all of these things play a huge role in the things that shape meaning and shape culture and societies. And then within our own sphere, of the leftist sphere, understand that us esoteric leftists aren't here to harm anybody, and we're not here to force anything on anybody who doesn't want to have anything to do with it. We're here to aid, we're here to help, we're here to fight alongside you, we're here to unearth some of the things that we've learned from our own paradigms that are able to help strengthen the paradigm that already exists within the leftist sphere. So just I implore people to take that into account when dealing with esoteric leftists. And as for the esoteric leftist community, even though there's not really a community per se, it's just kind of loose alliances of individuals. Let's make sure that we are also cleaning house in that regard, and not repeating some of the terrible habits of purity and purging and all of those things that we see happening when people's identities are super tethered to the communities that they're a part of. So yeah, that's what I have to say, just to round up.
Yeah, this is great. I completely agree. Actually, there are so many things. Take a chance. You completely missed the stream. You should take a look at it, because we explicitly discussed this sort of stuff. So yeah, I was saying that we should work together, and there's so much stuff that we haven't talked about today, I believe. And I think that we should keep working together because there is no reason not to. There is literally no fucking reason not to be together, all of us, you know. And we should think critically about our communities and think about our community. And yes, we shouldn't neglect the soul of the proletariat.
Exactly. We should fight for the soul of the proletariat, as you so well aptly put it.
So I think it's time for us to finish. What do you have in the works? Tell us. Plug your stuff.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much. I have a video coming out this weekend, Saturday evening for Patreon, Sunday evening for everybody else. And that video will be tackling social capital and social justice. So a couple of the things that I've been discussing in this video are going to end up in my actual video that I'm going to be doing. I also have a couple more live streams that I'm doing with some other YouTubers. If you want to know more about what I'm going to be doing in the next couple of weeks, feel free to come check me out on Twitter @SpeaksAngie. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and I believe for people who are in UK, there is a live event, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
That you're participating. What was it again?
Yes. So it's an event at the Imperial
Labor Society, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Imperial Labor Society, where me, Philosophy Tube, H Bomber Guy, and Bad Mouse Productions are going to be speaking. I feel pretty intimidated by it because I'm like the smallest person there, so it should be interesting. But if you're in the UK and you're interested in checking it out, you can go to my Twitter page. The link to the event information is posted there. So yeah, if you want to check that out, that will be happening on the 29th. And if you are unable to because you're not in the UK, I believe that the event will be filmed and put on, I think, H Bomber's channel. So if you want to check that out. The topic that we'll be discussing is politics in the age of YouTube, which I definitely have a lot to say about. So maybe I won't be shy. Who knows? I'll probably have a few drinks before.
This is amazing. And I also retweeted it on my page, so you can find it on my Twitter as well. The link to the YouTube page, to your YouTube, Angie Speaks, is in the description of this video and audio on SoundCloud and iTunes, if you're listening to this in audio. So, Angie, thank you very much for your time. I was glad to talk about those things. It was very eye-opening in many ways, and I'm really glad that there is so much common ground between people who are embracing esoteric ideas and not embracing them. It's just weird not to work together, but there's so much that those two traditions can learn from each other. So thank you very much.
For sure. And thank you for inviting me on. I would love to chat to you again, so don't ever feel afraid to ask.
Nice, thank you. So people, subscribe to Eastern Marsh and subscribe to Angie Speaks. Give us both money on Patreon. Like, thank you very much for sticking with us. Yeah, and see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.